posture, leveling, and everything else that's new. Here are 9 things every FromSoft fan needs to know about Sekiro. If you've played any Miyazaki games, you're probably pretty excited right now. From Software's latest game, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, is out now, and it's excellent. But as much as veteran Soulsborne players will recognise many of the game's systems, a lot of what's here is very different. In this video then, I'll be talking about basics like posture and combat, as well as more detailed stuff about leveling and difficulty spikes. And remember that timecodes for each section are in the description below. And while there will be some elements of this video that show bosses and locations, most of it is quite early on, and I won't be talking about story specifics or locations of particular artifacts. Here are 9 things every Souls fan needs to know about Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. It makes sense to start with the basic stuff, but let's talk specifically about the things that are different from classic Souls games. The game's protagonist, Wolf, is incredibly mobile, and you'll need to take advantage of this to give yourself an edge. Unlike Bloodborne or Dark Souls, you can jump from a standing start, and there's no fall damage here. Unless you're obviously on the edge of a zone, there's no reason not to jump down and explore new places. And on a similar note, the penalties for missing your jumps are softer too. Fall down a gap and the game will restart you where you fell, rather than throwing you back to the nearest bonfire, or in this case, Sculptor's Idol. Does that mean it's easier? Well, not really. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. This also doesn't count if an ogre throws you off a cliff. On top of this, there are loads of stealth-specific moves you can use to stay hidden, and you can tell when you're concealed by the vignette effect around the screen. So stealth is important then, but remember that primarily this is still a combat game. You can make your life easier by using stealth to perform death blows from the shadows, and this is especially useful when you need to thin out enemies around a more difficult mini-boss. The triangles above enemy heads will notify you when you've been spotted and are being actively pursued, but you can usually get up high, avoid their line of sight, and attack them again when they've stopped looking for you. But again, to reiterate, this isn't MGS5. You'll have to come out of the shadows eventually. The structure of the world itself bears the most resemblance to classic Miyazaki games, albeit with some minor tweaks. Fog gates are back, for example, but they're most commonly found blocking paths beyond some of the game's tougher mini-bosses. And on that note, you can expect to fight far more progression-stopping sub-bosses in Sekiro. These guys are everywhere. And again, this is something we'll get onto later, but there's usually no way to brute force these fights by over-leveling. You're just going to have to get through it. There are also branching paths in the game, including the old Miyazaki favourite of the dark, threatening pit with a heavy suggestion of nope. The main thrust of the game, however, is linear and interconnected, a bit like Lordran. You can look up and see places you'll eventually get to, and various gates and doors will lead you back to where you began. There are also separate areas you can walk to by praying at the shrine of the dilapidated temple. I won't spoil anything here, I'll just say these are important and you should investigate them. And as a general rule, you should take the time to explore everything. Gear and upgrades are easy to find if you look around and talk to NPCs, but you will walk right past them if you don't. And because of the more forgiving resurrection mechanics, there's less threat here in taking the time to fully check a new area. And remember that you can swim. Not only is it a useful way of getting past some enemies, but the water often contains treasure carp, giant fish who drop important currency for the late game. Kill them and take their scales. And finally, one more tip in terms of the world. This is a Japanese game set in a version of Japan, so consider playing it in Japanese. The English dub isn't bad, but it does feel slightly odd. I played it in English for capture purposes, but I'll definitely be starting again in the native language. Not only that, but subtitles will make it easier to spot important information.
Keep your eyes peeled out there, huh?
On to combat next. The red bars represent yours and your opponent's vitality. The yellow bar beneath it represents posture, which I've dedicated the next entry to. The red dots next to an enemy profile shows how many death blows it'll take to kill them, and some tougher foes can only be killed by death blows. This is one of the most important differences in terms of how the game plays. You can perform death blows by breaking an enemy's posture, either by filling the posture bar or depleting their health. And remember that if they have 2 dots, you'll have to do either of these things twice. You also need to be aware of perilous attacks. These are represented on screen by a glowing icon and they can't be parried. You'll need to jump over sweeping attacks and dodge thrusts and lunges. Early on, you'll be able to unlock a counter that will let you step through enemy spear attacks, dealing massive posture damage. And you can also kick sweeping enemies by pressing jump twice. Again, this does serious damage to their posture. For each fight then, you have to decide how to balance your offense and defense. If your first attack on an enemy deals loads of posture damage, you can safely keep attacking to get a death blow. If it doesn't, you may need to switch your tactics and damage their posture by defending well, which we'll look at next. And this is perhaps the most important change to combat. That yellow bar I mentioned before fills up when you deflect incoming attacks by pressing block at exactly the right time or when you deal damage, but the exact amounts vary for each type of enemy. The less vitality an enemy has, the quicker their posture bar will fill, and if they run out of vitality completely, they'll be open to a death blow. But it's almost impossible to kill some bosses by depleting their vitality alone, and all the toughest enemies can only be killed by death blows, so you will need to learn to deflect attacks. The good news is that the timing seems significantly more generous than parries in Dark Souls or Bloodborne. Your posture bar will fill as you get hit or block attacks, leaving you vulnerable if your posture breaks. But at least you only have this to worry about. There's no stamina meter in Sekiro, so you can run, block, deflect and attack as much as you want. Just always keep an eye on that posture bar. If you're struggling with this, there's a character near the dilapidated temple called Hanbei with whom you can practice parries, attacks, dodges and specific skills. This is a useful departure for a Miyazaki game, perhaps representing just how different the combat in Sekiro is. If you feel like your timing is off, definitely give this a try. You're probably already aware of how the Shinobi prosthetic works, but it's worth taking a moment here to hammer home just how important it is for defeating certain enemies. You don't need it to beat specific NPCs, but it will make life easier. Enemies with glowing red eyes are susceptible to flame attacks, for instance, so if you're struggling with the ogre, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I did, make sure you explore and find the flame vent. Likewise, enemies with shields are more manageable with the loaded axe. I'm not going to spoil specific locations here, just make sure you talk to all the NPCs you can and listen to their advice. Stick the subtitles on if it helps.
Appears you've taken to it quite well.
You're going to die a lot in Sekiro. In some respects, it's more punitive than the Souls games, in others, it's more forgiving. When you die, you lose half of the XP you've acquired towards the next level and half of your sen. There's no way to get this back. The only thing that makes a difference is a background mechanic called Unseen Aid. There's a percentage chance of this triggering displayed in the pause screen. The highest it can be is 30% and the lowest is 5%. And if it triggers when you die, you don't lose anything. If and perhaps when you die repeatedly in Sekiro, you incur something called Dragon Rot. This is represented by rot essence items in your inventory, showing the people in the world who've been inflicted with the disease. Each NPC in the game has their own percentage chance of contracting the disease, and the more NPCs suffering from it, the lower your chance of unseen aid will be. It's bad then, but don't worry about this too much. Without going into the details, this ties into the story elements of the game. Talk to Emma at the dilapidated temple to learn a bit more. And on a related note, we'll talk about resurrection next. The Shadows Die Twice bit of the title isn't a misnomer, and this is one of the elements that can make Sekiro seem more forgiving than its Soulsborne brethren. You get 2 chances to come back to life after you're killed, represented by the pink circles above your vitality bar. One of these can be replenished by resting at a sculptor's idol. The other is earned by killing larger enemies and performing death blows. That means it's worth cutting down a few enemies if you're in a tight spot and you need to restore your chance to resurrect. Whatever happens though, there's a cooldown on your resurrections. A black slash through the icons means that it's not available, so you can't just come back twice if you're killed in quick succession. You should also remember that you can use resurrections to your advantage. Some enemies will stroll away once they've killed you, so you can pop back up and deliver a death blow. Some enemies, as we can see here, however, will not. If posture is the biggest difference to the action elements of the game, leveling up is the biggest structural change. When I first got stuck on a tough enemy, my instincts were to grind for a while and then come back. But Sekiro doesn't work that way. To level up your stats, you need to have 4 prayer beads, which are usually acquired by defeating bosses and tougher enemies. Once you've got 4, you can level up at any sculptor's idol, but this does mean the progression is largely linear. There's no shortcut to increase vitality or attack power. Attack power is increased separately by confronting powerful memories known as remnants, and again, these are usually only dropped by powerful bosses, so there's no way of permanently buffing your damage output other than by progressing through the game. Your healing gourd, Sekiro's approximation of the Estus flask, can be upgraded by collecting gourd seeds and taking these back to Emma at the shrine. These drop slightly more often. If you see an enemy guarding a fog gate or one that requires multiple death blows, there's a strong chance they'll drop a seed if you kill them. You can also increase the potency of the gourd by purchasing skills at sculptor's idols. This is the most traditional way of leveling up, using XP you get from fighting enemies. But remember, these are skills, not attributes. You might unlock new moves, but they won't necessarily make you more powerful. In this respect, Sekiro can be a challenging experience early on, even for experienced Souls players. There's no simple way of getting past the difficult areas early on, other than by dying a lot, exploring everywhere for helpful prosthetics, and learning from your mistakes. Your many, many, many mistakes. That last one was really lucky. And finally, let's talk about the online elements. I'll keep it brief, there isn't one. Gone are the days of player invasions and jolly cooperation. This could be considered good or bad depending on your past experiences, but it does also mean that you can safely pause Sekiro. Yes, actually pause it like a normal game. I know, it just feels weird, doesn't it? Just one caveat before we finish: talking to NPCs doesn't pause the action, so make sure the coast is clear before you decide to sit down for a chinwag. You might miss something important.
That will be all.
And that's it. I've intentionally only scratched the surface, but please share your spoiler-free tips in the comments below and let me know how you're getting on with Sekiro. And as ever, hit that like button if you found any of this useful and subscribe to the channel for more weekly shows and features.